Today, we're delighted to welcome D. Venkat Rao, who teaches literature, literary theory, and many other things at the EFLU, and is a provocative thinker about the nature of the humanities in India. Professor Rao's interests include literary and cultural studies, epic traditions, visual cultures, comparative thought, translation, and especially what he calls mnemocultures, as spelled M-N-E-M-O, memory, mnemocultures, or that is to say, the transmission and cultivation of culture through collective memory. His notion of a critical humanities of and for the Indian context, a rethinking of how the humanities have been defined in Western Europe and North America and imposed elsewhere, raises questions that should be urgent for all of us who inhabit institutions like this one, in what he calls the intimate alien house of the university. Professor Rao's recent work includes India, Europe, and the Question of Cultural Difference, published in 2021, Performative Reflections of Indian Traditions Towards a Livable Learning, also 2021, and a collection of essays by various hands, extremely provocative collection called Critical Humanities from India, Contexts, Issues, and Fortunes from 2018. His forthcoming work is titled Envisioning Voice and the Aphasic Ears of Sanskrit Reflective Traditions Today. He's designed several courses on culture and technology and how they confront Sanskrit traditions, as well as a research program under the rubric of critical humanities. Following his visit and incorporating some of the exchanges of the next few days, we will publish an extensive interview with Professor Rao in our digital salon arcade. At the conclusion of his talk, I'll mention his other appearances at Stanford this week, but right now I want to welcome somebody who has come 8,000 miles to spend a few days thinking about the humanities with us. Having made that trip myself, I don't underestimate it. Thank you so much and welcome to Stanford.
Good evening, good afternoon, good morning. Thank you, Professor Green, for such warm invitation and those warm words. It is indeed, for me, an honor and a privilege to be at the Stanford Humanities Center. This center, I began to notice and began to learn in the last few days that it's in its attentiveness to contemporaneity and its concern for much cherished foundations of humanities, that is disciplines of thought that are developed in the field of humanities like music, literature, philosophy, and painting, history. And it's openness to all kinds of experimentation across these disciplines and the ways in which these disciplines interact with each other. And also in its kind of extraordinary hospitality towards receiving questions and then arranging for provocative discussions and exchanges, I thought that this center is a unique, extraordinarily unique place. And it's an honor to be here, especially for someone like me, who does his own bit of work in some corner of the world, and who never knows where the work goes, if it travels at all. And then that when you begin to hear that the work that you do is also received, and there is a hospitality from elsewhere, I'm deeply honored and deeply touched by this invitation. What I wish to do in this kind of opportunity, this opportunity that has been given to me, is to share with you what happens to humanities, the discipline of humanities, or the discipline of thought called humanities, when it travels elsewhere, or when it is implanted with force and violence elsewhere. And that's a kind of humanities puts me in what I call a double bind. And I'd like to share with you some thoughts about this double bind. What happens when it goes to places where it has not originated, and what responses can it evoke from those places? This is what I'd like to share with you today. I came to humanities in my 20s. I drifted towards humanities in my 20s in a small town, not a very significant town. Historically it was, but not anymore. But my reflection on the humanities began to emerge much later in the teaching context. When I began to teach, when I faced the students, it began to occur to me, what's the nature of the work that I'm doing? Who am I teaching? What is it that I'm teaching? Why am I teaching whatever the text that I'm teaching? When I say this in the humanities classroom of literature, the texts are canonical texts from Chaucer to modern times or Beowulf to Virginia Woolf. That's the canon. And then this is what we have been exposed to for a long time. And we learned and developed on the basis of that kind of training. So when I began to teach a bunch of students, it began to occur to me, what is it that I'm doing? Semester after semester, I would face the same kind of questions. Why am I designing this course? Who am I designing? Who are these people whom I am teaching? Above all these questions, one significant question remained persistently nagging me in the work that I do. Who is it who is teaching these courses? So this began this unease, but I was not able to kind of formulate and then began to thematize this unease. Only the teaching context over a period of time began to, kind of make me realize that after all, the teaching context in which I'm involved is fundamentally asymmetrically constructed. And it's not been asymmetrically constructed by some individuals. It is structurally asymmetric. From its inception, it has been asymmetrically conceived. What is the asymmetry here? The asymmetry is between the context which generates these discourses, celebrates this heritage, celebrates the authors, and then tends to think that these are the symbols of highly developed civilization. That's one kind of context. And it develops the methodologies of teaching, it develops the concepts of teaching, and it tends to think that these concepts must be universalized because they have a universal value. Then there is another context. And the other context is people who receive this, where it is being implanted with force and with violence and with persuasion. So for various reasons, people who receive them they begin to identify themselves with that and they begin to groom themselves towards that. So there is a structural asymmetry that prevails. This structural asymmetry does one significant thing. It mutes the context of reception. I tend to see this asymmetry is between context of production and context of reception. I don't think this is peculiar to literature classes. This is the structure of teaching in the context which faced colonialism for quite a long time. So in such contexts, there is a certain kind of asymmetry that prevails. So this, structurally mutes, and I would say mutates the context of reception. It mutes because it is insensitive to, it is not trained to pay attention to the context of the receivers. So this question began to come to me with force. Who am I teaching? Who are these people whom I am teaching? An Indian classroom poses a certain kind of challenge. I'll talk about it. Now, the asymmetry, it seems to me, fundamentally skewed the relationship between the context of reception and the context in which this kind of civilization messages is developed. The interface, one tends to wonder whether the interface, whether the people who received the imposition did not respond to it over the historical, extended historical period. I don't think so. People did respond, but the asymmetry continued to remain, and the responses were recognized only when these responses are ventriloquized, when they are put in the form according to the methods and according to the concepts that have been devised and then that have been implanted in the cultures which faced colonialism. So the question that began to occur to me is that, is there a possibility of a response at all from the muted and mutated context of reception? Is there a possibility of responding to European thought? As you can see, the asymmetry is between Europe and, in my context, India. It could be in the context of Africa as well and other places, but in my context, it is India. So this began to pose challenge to my own kind of teaching. I began to wonder, what is it that can be done? Is there a possibility for the context itself to begin to respond to the context, to the context of production? That's the question that began to emerge. Okay, so this situation of asymmetry puts one in the double bind. The double bind is a kind of scenario where whatever you receive appears to be salubrious to you. It is helpful to you. It provides you health. But at the same time, it begins to deteriorate your health. It begins to auto-immunize you. So you take more of it and it begins to debilitate your own immune system. That's the kind of double bind one is involved in. But there's a double bind situation where you cannot simply dispense with the medicine that you have been administered. There is no alternative to the universities today in cultures like ours, in contexts like mine. There's no alternative to that right away. I don't see any kind of alternative. One can't get rid of these discourses. One can't say humanity should be stopped from being taught and the universities must be closed down. That's not an alternative. So you take it, but at the same time, you must be aware, you must be alerted to the fact that the more you take it, the more it is going to be detrimental to your situation. So what does one do in that kind of double bind situation? Faced with a double bind, it seemed to me from the classroom scenario that one must learn to make a double move. Faced with a double bind, you can't get rid of the university, but you need to make a double move. The double move is you need to understand and expose yourself as best as you can to Europe, or the discourses and methods and the concepts and the heritage that Europe has given to you, to the extent it is relevant to the kind of inquiry that you are interested in. One must expose in good faith, not with any kind of alibi, but in good faith, one must expose oneself to the context of production. This does not mean that one tends to translate oneself, transform oneself, once again, mutate oneself on the basis of the frames that have been implanted and imposed on you. It is not that. You need to expose yourself to Europe as best as you can in order to understand why and how Europe functions in that way. When I say Europe, I mean the Western education, and what Europe and West are more or less interchangeable at this stage for me, because the discipline of humanities I associate largely with Europe. And that's the first move. One must, in good faith, expose oneself to Europe as best as one can, receive the concepts, engage with them, and see what can be done with that. Not in order to translate yourself, but in order to understand why Europe tends to ask a certain kind of questions, why Europe tends to develop a certain kind of concepts. Why do these things happen only in a certain kind of context? That is called Europe. That's move one. The move two is the more difficult move. The second move is to try and then take the risk of configuring the context of reception. In my situation, it is India. To configure, when I say we, what do you mean by we? Who is this we? Is there a homogeneous we in the context of your scenario? That's the question that comes up. In the context of what is called expediently India, this question remains a very big challenge. So what I tend to call the critical humanities is something that tends to make this double move. Receive Europe, but at the same time, learn to respond to Europe by configuring the context of reception. So how do we understand this? How do we understand the question of how do we grapple with the question of the we? By looking at the common process, by looking at the way we receive Europe. We receive Europe on the basis of the cultural forms that Europe disseminates and disperses. What are these cultural forms? The cultural forms are, let's say, philosophy, literature, painting, music, whole range of things. These are distinctive cultural forms. If we try to understand Europe on the basis of these cultural forms, similar kind of, or some kind of cultural forms must be there in the context of reception as well. So I would remain largely specific to the Indian scenario, which I'm a little bit familiar with. So European resources are colossal. The navigation is difficult. Which ones to choose, which particular kind of tradition to follow within Europe is a more difficult question. But in the Indian context, such a kind of configuration of the we is yet to occur to anybody's satisfaction. There is no we of India. Though, of course, the idea, the geopolitical notion of India is there, but that has a very barely minimal kind of intimate relation it can provide to large number of masses. Okay, this is a controversial issue, but I can't help pointing it out because the inquiry that I'm pursuing will take me somewhere else. So it seemed to me that the humanities, through this kind of inquiry over several years of time, humanities, why is it, simple question, like why is it the domain of humanities or the domain of sciences did not emerge? It's a major question for people who work in the philosophy of science area. Why is it the sciences did not develop in other Asia? This is Needham's question, they say. Okay, so why is it modern sciences did not develop in any other culture excepting in the West? Similarly, why is it the humanities discourses did not develop in any other culture excepting in European cultures? So these remain fundamental kind of questions. It seems to me that both science and humanities emerge where there is a certain kind of concern about the human, that is to say, where the human as the agent of thought and also human as the object and subject of exploration, when that gets foregrounded, it seemed to me that the humanities and the sciences begin to slowly emerge. So the European cultural background that one could sketch on the basis of major work done by accomplishments of major thinkers of Europe. For example, I'll give you one quotation. European legacy is dominated by the Christian heritage. All our thought is Christian through and through and entirely, which is to say all of us completely. It is a barely secularized heritage of theology. I'm sure some of you would recognize where these are coming from. One is from Jean-Luc Nancy, and the other is from Jacques Derrida. So major thinkers of Europe have configured the European background in very specific ways. If that is one way of understanding European background, how do we begin to figure something called the Indian background? Because we are talking about an asymmetric relationship. Europe can interpret the world, but the cultures of the world cannot interpret Europe. That's the asymmetric structure that continues to remain. Whether they should interpret or not is a different question. We can take it up. Why is it they have not interpreted is any more important kind of question. So it opens up a different way of thinking about living together on the same planet. Now, cultural forms are multiple. And it seems to me that one way of exploring cultural difference, the asymmetry between Europe and India, from the teaching context, one way of doing that is that while exploring the cultural forms, one recognizes that all the cultural forms, any cultural form, is contingent upon very specific kind of communication system. That there are every cultural form that we can think about, image, music, painting, or song, they're based on specific kind of communication systems. One can think about 5 distinctive communication systems. From the oral to the digital, one can think about 5 distinctive dominant communication systems. At every epoch, in a particular epoch, each of these dominant communication systems has configured what is considered to be knowledge, what is considered to be creativity, what is considered to be action, and what is considered to be a certain kind of knowledge. Okay, what are these ones? Oral is the first one, oral and gestural communication system, where everything is configured, all culture and knowledge and creativity are configured by that particular communication system. That gets displaced by scribal, and that gets displaced by print, and after that, audiovisual, and we are in the digital epoch. So these begin to reconfigure cultural forms in every culture, wherever these become prominent. Okay, so by looking at cultural communication systems and the kind of cultural forms a culture develops, there may be a possibility, this is one of the ways, there may be a possibility to find out cultural difference. And the hypothesis that I'm moving here is that cultures that privilege what I tend to call inscription. Inscriptional cultures are from scribal to digital, they are inscriptional cultures. What I mean by that is that their memory is externalized and retained outside the body. Cultures that actually tend to retain the memory, externalize the memory, and retain the memory in the externalized bodies, whether it's a notebook or tablet or wall or a database or any such thing in a chip or in a book, memory is externalized and retained outside the body. But cultures that retain the memory and then put the body to work consistently, constantly, persistently, these are cultures, what I tend to call mnemocultures. Okay, memory, cultures of memory. Memory is universal. Memory manifests. There's no culture without memory. When we are talking about culture, is in fact articulation of memory. So if that is the case, there are 2 significant ways in which memory can be articulated. One is externalizing the memory and retaining the externalized memory outside systems in surrogate bodies. Whereas cultures which prefer to retain memory in its articulation in the embodied performative and inactive modes, they can be differentiated. This is one way in which cultural difference can be explored. European culture, it is unthinkable for us to reflect on Christianity without scribality being at work. Okay, it's very difficult for anyone. Okay, European legacy has generated, it seemed to me, and I'm not saying it with any alibi, because what is more challenging is that there are no pure mnemocultures or there are no pure inscriptional cultures for us in my university context. How did the interface take place? How did cultures respond to the interface between the inscriptional and the mnemocultural? That becomes a major challenge, and that is a part of the research that we have been able to focus on. Okay, so Europe has generated what one can call the inscriptional psyche. It is the inscriptional psyche that develops the concepts and the methodologies, and these methodologies have become universally they've been universally implanted. Now, against this particular kind of background, it is necessary to take the risk of begin to talk about it. Now the challenge comes. I've just given you a basic outline of what I tend to think from the research context, from my teaching context, what I tend to see as the European background. It is very difficult to think about the Indian background because what we tend to call India is an assemblage, is a colossal heterogeneous assemblage of cultural formations, biocultural formations. And these biocultural formations cannot be tethered, cannot be homogenized under one name called India. It's extremely difficult. The reason is that, I usually give this as an example, Indian classroom is one of the most challenging scenarios. One tends to think that after all, it is an Indian classroom. For an outsider, one may see that this is an Indian classroom, they're all Indians. But in fact, each one sitting in the classroom comes from a background, a cultural background, which is at least 1,000 years old, minimally speaking. I'm sure there are other cultures also. But since I'm facing the Indian classroom, each student who sits in my classroom has a legacy of 1,000-year-old culture. He or she is the heir of that particular culture. Okay. But to what extent that person today is in a position to relate herself or himself that particular kind of background? To what extent the teacher who is exposed to them is sensitive to the cultural background of the context of reception. My students are receiving Europe and European thought through the discourses, through the canonical text that I'm, kind of teaching them. What's their background? Does the background go with this? What kind of background they come from? Do they understand? Have we begun to reflect on our background? These questions began to crop up, and then these began to challenge, come in the way of teaching in an honest way. And so one is compelled to face the challenge of thinking through these kind of problems. So what is the way in which we can begin to think about the we of the context? That is India in my case. How do we begin to think about that? It seemed to me that after exploring quite a bit of time through various kind of resources under the rubric of India, it seemed unhelpful to me. So I began to reflect on that and what is available most tangibly in my classroom. Probably this is a case with many other classrooms as well. There's not extraordinarily unique, that the students come with distinctive languages. Indian classroom is composed of students who bring into the classroom multiple languages. These languages are like Tamil, like Telugu, Kannada, Marathi, Hindi, Urdu, a whole range of languages. And remember, each of these languages has a background, extraordinarily spread out work available today, and people are connected to those works. This work manifests in terms of image, music, text, and performance. All these major ways in which this work is imparted today, even to this day. So is there a way in which we can begin to see a certain kind of connecting thread across all these languages? It seemed to me that Sanskrit alone provided a possibility of that. It is through Sanskrit one can begin to see a certain kind of connectivity across the cultural forms that these students who are sitting in my classroom, who are the heirs of a certain kind of culture, they inherit. And so all the languages, all the major languages of India, why Sanskrit? How Sanskrit remains the challenge. And it's difficult today in today's world because of a certain kind of stigmatization of Sanskrit that has happened over several years. It is difficult to bring forth this argument, but it is necessary. It's a risky argument, but it is necessary to bring forth. Sanskrit is a name of a language which had no name for nearly 2 millennia. Sanskrit was not the name of a language that we tend to call today Sanskrit. It was a nameless language. It is called Anami in Hindi. It's a nameless language. For 2000 years, nobody used the word Sanskrit. Panini never used it. Buddha never used it. So none of these people used this language. It was simply called utterance, bhasha. It was called utterance, or it was called chandas, metrics. Okay, these are the names that were used. It had no name at all. It is only in the Common Era people began to call it Sanskrit. Sanskrit is not even a proper name. Sanskrit is an adjective. Sanskrit means that which actually purifies something, that which actually renders something into pure, refines it. Okay, something that finesses something. Okay, it has various other kind of meanings. Number one. Number two, it traversed, it had no origins. One has never been able to find out what the origins of this language are. Okay, one cannot definitively, exhaustively point out what the origins of Sanskrit are. Okay, so, and also, but it traversed, it moved across all kinds of continents, all kinds of people, all kinds of polities. Wherever there was hospitality to this language, it went away. It never ever created a concept called nation. It went ahead, and then people received it. Many cultures, for thousands of years, it remained with other languages and other cultures. Okay, it was never imposed because it never traveled with a sword or a scepter. Sanskrit moved across many languages, many fields, many people, many communities, many polities, unforeseen polities. It moved across, but it never was supported by an army or any particular kind of religion. And it interacted with the languages, but the languages flourished. The languages, the given, the remaining, the available languages with which it interacted, it fecundated those languages. These languages were enriched. There's a tremendous example. Many examples can be given in the Indian context, but beyond what is called India. So if you go to Indonesia, if you go to Vietnam, if you go to Laos, Thailand, Cambodia, a whole range of places, for 1,000 years, 1,500 years, the language remained there. And Sanskrit can be seen in all those languages that are used even today in many of these places. Within the Indian context, every student who's sitting in my classroom inherits a language. And that language, all the major reflective terms of that language come from Sanskrit. All the major extraordinarily significant terms come from Sanskrit language. So it seemed to me that strategically, that's one particular kind of thread which can be woven across these distinctive, apparently distinctive, and also really significantly distinctive cultural forms that each of these students is an heir to. So there's a way in which one can begin to work through that. So Sanskrit provided a way of taking the risk of configuring what we tend to call V of the context of reception. On the one hand, we have a certain understanding of through European background, which many major European, respectable European thinkers have given us. On the other hand, it is the task of the teacher to begin to take the risk and then configure what we tend to call the V of the context of reception. This is precisely what we were trying to do in the Indian context. So Sanskrit, I can't go into detail, but this just only a kind of sketch. Sanskrit developed over 3,000-4,000 years, extraordinarily wide-ranged kind of cultural forms. They are from the Vedic times 4,000 years ago to contemporary times, multiple genres in which it manifested. What is significant about these cultural forms is that they, to a very large extent, remain what I tend to call mnemocultural. That is, they're embodied and enacted. They have to be recited, they have to be performed. Every time somebody recites a particular kind of composition, a genre, one renders and one performs. When one goes to a temple, one does not see the artwork as such. One closes one's eyes and moves around the temple. And then, so there is a certain kind of embodied nature to the cultural forms that have been generated, and they continue to flourish even to this day, even after inscription has made inroads into these cultures. Writing came into India in the from 3rd century BC onwards. Okay, writing spread across. Yet at the same time, the domain called Indology has not been able to definitely find out what the impact of writing has been in the last 2,300 years on Indian psyche. When you look at the Greek background and the kind of major accounts that have emerged, you'll begin to see that the definitive impact of writing on the thought of European background. Okay, writing changed the entire way of thinking. Logic would not have been possible. Grammar would not have been possible. Philosophy, science, this whole story, this grand narrative continues to be repeated. But you have something completely counter to that in the context of Sanskrit reflective traditions. The way Panini, the greatest of the grammarians that humankind appears to have seen, had no use for writing. He didn't know what writing was. Okay, so but even to this day, Panini is invoked, and now the computer folk tend to think that there is a way in which Sanskrit can be used to do certain kind of miracles. That I'm not very confident about that, but so this mnemocultural background is rendered, practiced every day by many of these people. So I'm facing a classroom where the asymmetry can begin to be addressed by focusing on the backgrounds from which the students come and the background from which the celebrated, respected, canonized, institutionalized knowledge systems are provided. Through us, these are being imparted. Okay. Well, Sanskrit also came across, like Europe, came across other cultures, interacted with other people. How did Sanskrit respond? Sanskrit seems to have remained maintained a certain kind of cultivable indifference towards the foreign. Interacted with the foreign, but it remained indifferent towards the foreign. Not out of any kind of disparagement of others, because they interacted with them. Their Sanskrit had impacted the languages, given local languages, but it seemed to have remained indifferent to that. I'll give you one quick example so that the point I'm making can become more clear. Huan the Chinese traveler who visited India in 7th century, spent several years in Nalanda. There's not a single document that I'm familiar with which points out that the teachers of Nalanda, Buddhist teachers, ever engaged in any kind of discussion with Huan about Confucius or Lao Tse. They did not show any kind of interest. This Lao Tse and Confucius never appeared in the discussions. So this remained very peculiar. So what happened to Islam? Because Islam lived in India for before the Britishers came, 800 years, much before that, Islam came. But it seems to me that the literature shows that, in my forthcoming work points out some of these things. There is a complete indifference towards Islam. There was no intellectual engagement with Islam at all. And it seems to me, extending this in the European case also, I begin to wonder whether there was any genuine, real communication between Sanskrit and the European knowledge system. This looks completely counterintuitive what I'm saying, because 200 years of German Indology shows something else. They have learned the languages. Many of the German scholars have learned the languages and then elaborately, painfully, laboriously translated this. But it still seems to me that whether there was any interaction. What the German scholars were doing was, to a large extent, take the framework and then impose the framework on the basis of which study the Sanskrit texts, Sanskrit cultural forms. This continues to happen even to this day, it seems to me. So was there a genuine communication? Even today, I find it extremely difficult in my inquiries to see any major European thinker, contemporary thinker, engaging with Sanskrit. Why should one engage with Sanskrit? That question is always open, but such kind of interaction seems still, it is something that is yet to come. So this Sanskrit spread across, both vertically and horizontally across India. There are ways in which one can begin to think about what we tend to call India or my classroom, on the basis of the distinctive kind of flows that moved in and then moved out. I try to talk about that through different kind of gateways through which the cultural flows came into India and then moved out of India. Now, it is possible to know that the classroom that is composed of these various flows that have come from very distinctive kind of places, and these in turn carry the intimations of the culture across many parts of the world. And that is something that is very significant. But my interest is, to a large extent, humanities classroom, which I tend to handle. But then there is a gap. There is a certain kind of rupture that has taken place with the colonial period. And that's why the humanities tend to dominate, and then the culture of reception remains muted. what's the gap? How did this gap emerge? European knowledge systems, to a large extent, are either bracketed or displaced or denigrated. What tends to be called there's the phenomenon that one sees wherever colonialism spread. Um, uh, the distinctive cultural intimations were either stigmatized or skewed or misrepresented or denigrated. That's something that has happened. It has had colossal impact on the classroom, in my view. How does that happen? Because the cultural forms that are developed in the Indian context, these cultural forms are developed by very distinctive kind of communities, which I tend to call biocultural formations. These biocultural formations come from, they're countless. Nobody counts them. They're uncountable. A 9th century Sanskrit text says, I'll use it Sanskrit, I'll recite in Sanskrit and then try to explain you. Jatyanantam tu sampraptam tadvaktum naiva shakyate. That is how the word that is used for biocultural formation, the Sanskrit word is called jati, that which generates something and differentiates. Okay. So the generative and differentiative impulse is infinite and it cannot be counted. Whatever it produces cannot be counted. That's what the Sanskrit line says. Jatis multiply, but each jati, that is a biocultural formation, each jati tends to develop distinctive kind of cultural forms of its own. These are they emerge in two distinctive formats. One is called vidya, that is that which is uttered by means of the mouth, and the other is called kala, which is rendered by means of the body, gestures, sound and gestures, verbal medium, and then the visual medium. These are the two media through which cultural forms are produced by these distinctive biocultural formations. And what we tend to call, if there is something called culture in India, that culture is the product of essentially these countless number of biocultural formations. It cannot be homogenized all that easily. They are there throbbing in your classroom. They participate in these cultural forms every day, every season, for every festival, even to this day. That is what they produce, what they participate in, we can begin to call public humanities. This is spread across the places. Even today, this is throbbing and alive. There are many things that can be said in Indian languages, but I'm controlling myself. There's no time. But this cultural impulse, this extraordinary cultural impulse has been disrupted, has been skewed, has been stigmatized. How does that happen? How did that happen? Jati has been configured in the interface between Europe and India as an oppressive mechanism imposed by very few people, which is going to be beneficial to them. So it has been stigmatized. So you tend to denigrate and you tend to hate your own biocultural formation, your own provenance, and your cultural forms. You tend to distance yourself from that. That is an impulse, that's a mechanism that has been implanted, and it continues to function in very strange ways in the classroom scenario even to this day. That's why it is very difficult for a teacher who senses this to make the students to begin to reflect on the background from which their cultural forms have emerged. That becomes very difficult. It's tough, but one will have to work. When a student tends to see, after some discussion, the student tends to see this, and then the student is able to overcome that, and then he or she is in a position to do very interesting kind of work. So the risk will have to be taken, and one will have to ask this, continue this research. So the turn to Sanskrit, how is it going to be helpful? It is going to be helpful in the classroom scenario, which is asymmetrically structured, to begin to configure what we tend to call V in the Indian context. The second important way in which Sanskrit can help, it seems to me, to connect to Europe. The second important way is that Sanskrit is considered to be, in the 19th century, there's an extraordinary explosion of feverish research called finding the origin language of all the European languages, European homeland and origin for European languages, which is called Indo-European language. This is, to me, it's an imaginary construct. But if there is a legacy and if there is an heir, if there is a descendant of that language which has maintained a certain kind of consistency of thought over millennia, it is Sanskrit. So every European Indologist or every Western thinker today, in order to trace the conceptual background of European terms, they go back to, they invoke Sanskrit. If Sanskrit had sustained that originary impulse of the so-called common language, it is important to find out what path Sanskrit has taken in its thought. Europe also inherited Greek and Latin. They have inherited, and many other languages have inherited this Indo-European background. If that is so, how did the departure, how did the parting of the ways, how did they affect these distinctive cultures? That inquiry has not happened. That inquiry, no, I've been exploring that. If there are people who have worked in this area, I'd like to learn from them. But that inquiry is something that is yet to be undertaken for the simple reason that all the Indo-European languages are being studied on the basis of the frameworks that have been developed from the European background in the 19th century. So there is no way in which the living language, inheritor of the much older archaic language, how did that inheritor, before Europe even began to impose itself or interface with it, how did that language think? The textures of thought, the cultural forms, distinctive, lively cultural forms, which are alive even to this day. So one can think about many crucial Greek terms, for example, ousia, ease, being, aporia, whole range of terms one can think about. All these can be traced back to Sanskrit, which in many verses, many compositions, they're alive even to this day. This entire range of languages is alive to this day. So this is a bigger challenge for us, both for me as a teacher in the Indian context, but also exposure to the European thought. But at the same time, it's a certain kind of way in which one can begin to collaboratively think about how did these two departures, European departure on the one hand and Sanskrit departure on the other hand, independently, how did they develop? Why is it Europe has taken a particular kind of turn where it took the turn, according to Heidegger, a metaphysical turn? Why did it take a metaphysical turn? What happened in the case of Indian context? This is, to me, an extraordinary area where I think collaborative researches can be developed. I raised a lot of questions. If Sanskrit is the really, forgotten sibling, why is it Sanskrit is not able to speak to European? It can't, because the asymmetric structure is implanted, and then that everybody functions only from that particular kind of asymmetric structure. So I give a list of words here: physis, eidos, ousia. Physis is so crucial to think about the sciences. Heidegger's major journey is in fact exploring that, but Heidegger doesn't turn towards Sanskrit, interestingly, though he recognizes that the physis comes from the word bhu, bhavati, bhur, bhu, swaha. This language is a very different one. So this is a research, this is an inquiry that is yet to be done. So what my classroom seems to have taught me, having been exposed to European heritage, receiving it unknowingly, and then when we began to reflect on that, it began to open up something very significant and then more livable, more enlivening, I must say. And it threw open two challenges. One, to understand Europe and to understand India, but also understand the interface between them, and why is it the interface did not yield, it seems to me, the required kind of research, where on a planet which is composed of significantly heterogeneous communities and cultures and cultural forms, how do we begin to live together, even if we live differently? That remains a significant question. And it seems to me that's the fundamental question of the humanities. And but what's happening today is that by simply learning, I don't know Sanskrit, by the way, I'm not a trained Sanskrit scholar. By only knowing Sanskrit, one will be able to, take care of everything and then, redress the asymmetry as such. It's not possible. It's not possible. There's a new brand, a new breed of inquirers that has begun to emerge. Probably, I think, spurred by the Silicon Valley achievements, which I tend to call cyberneutics. Cyberneutics. These are not hermeneutics, but cyberneutics. These are the people who tend to think that Sanskrit opens up the master key to the entire world's knowledge and entire world's living. That is something that I am not entirely happy with. I am not very convinced by that. And I'm open to learning from these people. But a certain kind of computer generated programs can be used in order to render Sanskrit as a master key to understand the world. That I'm not entirely convinced about. But I think there's a significant task that awaits the humanities departments. From my context, I tend to think, and then in the institutional level and also with other governmental forces, I've been arguing that this needs to be done. If humanities will have to be rethought, it'll have to be rethought from what I tend to call the critical humanities space. The critical humanities for me are both humanities in a critical scenario. It's a critical situation. There's no support. That's one kind of thing. But it's critically important to think because it keeps alive the thought and across all kinds of odds. That's number two. Number three, critical, because it looks at what has been established asymmetrically, institutionalized as the natural one. It looks at what has been imposed from the receiving end. That's why it's a critical task. The fourth one is that the humanities, the human beings, the human communities, the biocultural formations I'm referring to, they're in a critical scenario. So it is important for us to think about these multiple cultural forms, which these heirs unknowingly, kind of segregated from them. They begin to turn away from them. So it is important for us to begin to think across all these levels and also bring together the thought stream of Europe and the thought stream which has been developed in my context from Sanskrit. So for this, I think the institutional program can be to think about putting together, bringing together both the classical trivium and quadrivium on the one hand, and the Vidyas and Kalas on the other. In the Indian scenario, one can begin to develop new researches, new teaching programs, and this can be done. It seems to me that the future of critical humanities is really contingent upon such thinking together, even if we differ in our ways of thinking. After all, humanities must provide a space for us to think together, provocative thinking. Yeah. So provocative exchanges can take place on sites like this, where even if we think differently, we would have a space to think together and see why our differences can be maintained or can be overcome. What are the ways in which we can overcome those differences? But who will take up this is the challenge that remains. That's an open challenge. And I return to my classroom to talk about these things. Thank you for patience. I'm open to question and answers.
Thank you. Thank you so much for your presentation and such insightful knowledge. I'm not very familiar with Indian culture. I'm not familiar with the humanities in that side of the world. But why is there such a desire to adapt? And I may be misreading this. Why is there such a desire to adapt the Western humanities to the Indian population? Since my assumption, at least with the little I know, is that there is probably a lot of humanities and knowledge native to India. Why is there such a need to bring that from the outside, right?
Absolutely relevant question. Two levels this question can be taken up. One is that I largely work with the given. The given to me is the university. I'm a university teacher. I go to the class. For the last 40 years, I've been going to the class as a teacher and meeting the students and teaching them certain kind of texts. These texts have been institutionalized. The job market is based on knowing these texts. This is very crucial. So that's the professional side of it. And that I'll have to do. So it is not that I have done that. For the last 200 years, this has been going on. So there is no other discipline that exists today that can begin to talk in the university context other than the disciplines of thought that have been implanted in the colonial period. That's at one level. Second level, your question is very right, and it points towards the rupture that has taken place. The everyday life where you see what you call, there is so much of humanities and then so much of innate culture. That is there. But then there is the university. There's a great divide between these two things. You tend to impose these very frameworks, very concepts, very thought structures, even to understand that. But that doesn't necessarily respond. It doesn't need you. The university is not necessary there. But we can't say that because millions of 45 million students go to higher education today. Okay. So what are the ways in which we can begin to overcome this kind of great divide? But the university has denigrated that culture and then turned the students, even the teachers, turn them against their cultural impulses. So when you come to the public fora, you tend to talk against them, or you tend to talk in the usual terms like oppressive structure, exploitative structure, usual catchphrases that are there. They are dead ends for research. And inquiry will have to take the risks of addressing them, reopening them. And it seems to me that is necessary. So your question is an absolutely relevant and important question. In the say, it points out the professional dilemma, the teacher as a professional, what is the work that he or she is doing? I began with those questions. What is it that I'm doing? Second is that how do you connect to the lively culture that is there, which doesn't need you? So how do we bring these two things? We can't get to the university. We can't say, oh, close down the university. There may be people who would be interested in that, but that we won't do that. I won't recommend that. So it is in that particular kind of crisis moment when I like to work. Yeah, I hope it. Yeah, thank you. Yes.
Thank you. Thank you very much for this very thought-provoking, stimulating talk. I guess I want to ask you, I come from Jewish studies, and I want to say there's also a little bit of a move to amongst the diasporists to move out of the geopolitical space into the Hebrew Republic of Letters. We will say the language, Hebrew, as a language to provide a space of cultural formation abroad. So I want to ask you, because you say, if I understand this correctly, but that you want to move to Sanskrit as a language with, right now I'm just from your slide, without a name, with untraceable origins, untraceable genealogy, wrote it anyway. And so then I'm very interested in this in this claim that it received hospitality anywhere. And so the way you present this, so this is not a challenge, it's really trying to understand this, is it received hospitality everywhere. You sort of take out the power dynamics of Sanskrit itself. I mean, how do I know that it actually is, it is received hospitably everywhere and is not hitting other people over the head, so to speak, in terms of enforcing its language regime, right? So I don't know whether that makes any sense, but yes. Because I mean, I don't know any of the historical details in that sense, but sure. I'm very curious about that. Yeah.
Well, I think that's a question that everybody will get. I myself began with that particular kind of question. How can it be possible that language and violence don't go together? Imposition, an entire work of Derrida talks about that. So why is it, where is the, how can you ignore the violence? One turn towards the historians and see whether any historical work has come into existence. I'm still open to examining the historical work, but much of the work that has come out now points out that such kind of, first of all, it's not supported by any military. It is not that a king went and then along with the military and imposed it. Military did not speak Sanskrit. They spoke some of the local languages. Okay, traders did not speak Sanskrit. Traders took along with them small bunches of groups of people. This is what the historians say, and who began in turn to establish their own small communities and then spread the language. So in the absence of trade and then politics, supporting in a mighty way the Sanskrit, whatever language or culture, I tend to call ethos and idiom. The ethos and idiom spread across. It is patronized by the kings later, undoubtedly, across all the places. The kings began to patronize that. But that did not become the court language in all the places. Sanskrit did not become the court language. So I'm open to historical inquiries with regard to violence associated with Sanskrit. The only kind of violence that contemporary historians talk about in the last 200 years they've been talking about is the violence against certain kind of what it described as jatis or biocultural formations. Oppressively, they maintain them in the lower status. But what is missing here in this kind of claim, this tendentious kind of claim, is that it's a complete ignorance and complete avoidance of the flourishing cultural, linguistic traditions of each of these communities who have been allegedly oppressed and then exterminated. There is no genocide associated with Sanskrit to my knowledge. If there is, I'd like to know. But I have not come across any such kind of instance until now. I hope it makes sense. Yeah, thank you.
I think that you were talking about the caste system. That was an interpretation from the Europeans. Is that what you're claiming?
Correct. There's a huge debate going on elsewhere. There is no caste system. Caste is a word which is a Portuguese word, casta. It comes from that, which talks about a hierarchical structure. There is no system of jatis. Jati, first of all, jati does not refer to human communities alone. It refers to trees, types of trees, groups of mountains, groups of waters. It's a much more general term to refer to distinctive heterogeneous species, human and non-human. And one use of that term is to refer to human compositions, human groups. But jati is never becomes, it never becomes a system. It cannot be homogeneously, seamlessly unified. The idea of the system is something that has come from Western sociology. In the last 150 years, 100 years, this is the only term. Nobody describes, nobody points out what the system here is. Because you try to prove the system in this particular, through this particular empirical inquiry, next door, that empirical inquiry is undermined by the anomaly that one tends to see against the system. So it cannot be, the argument that I tend to support is that it cannot be easily systematized. The jati impulse cannot be easily systematized. It is, I describe jati as a biocultural formation, perpetually internally self-differentiating. It just differentiates itself and then forms into new jatis.
So I don't know Indian history, but I don't know Indian history, so I'm confused a little bit by what you're saying, because from what I understood was that part of what the Congress Party's platform was to kind of eliminate this discrimination and stuff like that. So how does that play into this?
I think there are a lot of gaps here. There is no, the idea of discrimination that got into Constitution, okay? That there is what is called untouchability. It opens up a much larger discussion. But anyway, we go by the modern documents that are available, on the basis of which governance takes place, policies are decided, and then law functions, okay? That notion of untouchability has been banned. That one person does not touch the other person. That kind of notion has been banned already in the country, okay? So there is no question of elimination of jatis at all. It's not possible. Elections on an every year, every 5 years, elections are played on jati basis. Marriages, millions of marriages take place on jati basis. It's an everyday reality. If you just say, if one is a sociologist, one would take a look at the matrimony sites. They're all entirely, totally jati based. entirely, completely. So it is a living reality. Why? So you begin, one tends to see this as something negative, and then this is something exploitative. This is something, I'm not saying that there's no exploitation, there's no oppression in India, please. I'm not saying that at all. But take a look at the way these biocultural formations have functioned over millennia. What kind of cultural forms have they generated? Are they living or they dead? People participate in them or not? Do they come to your classroom with that background or not? Do they eliminate that background? No. So given these things, one needs to work with them. And then I'd like to work with them and see where they take us. They defy these kind of readings that have emerged in the last 100 years or 150 years. Such kind of institutionalization of a misreading, if you like, is something that one needs to re-examine. That's what I'm pointing out. This does not mean that India is a country with, absolutely no violence and no oppression. Please, I'm not making such claims. I can never make such claims, please. No. I hope it answers. Yeah, okay. Yeah, we'll take up. Yes. Yes. Sorry.
Thank you. Hi, I'm Atika. I'm a grad student here. It's a very fascinating talk that you've given, and some things are they really stand out to me as in your methodology and the conceptual frameworks that you're drawing. And this is the talk is going in the right direction because some of it is really like self-revealing also, especially when you bring in caste and casta. And just because caste has like suffered a huge deal of obscurity in the Western scholarship so far, I think your work greatly benefits from that obscurity, in my opinion. And what fascinates me is the term that you use, biocultural formations, for an earlier existing Sanskrit word jati, whereas you've had tons and tons and tons of scholarship from the oppressed castes that documents the anxieties and the discriminations and the violence inherent exactly in this system and the structure, and the understanding that you bring forth of it being read as a biocultural formation has never come from these castes itself. And for me, it falls into the same criteria, therefore, of theoretical Brahmins theorizing empirical Shudras and giving caste a fancy, beautiful name. And it's easy to do these in places like Stanford, is what I feel. But this is just my really like a grad student take on it. I'm really interested to know how your work as it concerns critical public humanities in India deals with the emerging field of critical caste studies and the challenges it poses to the inherent fallacies and discrimination um, in humanities as we deal with it in South Asia broadly, if not even in India. Yeah, and we can take the conversation also like later ahead of the room. Yeah.
Well, yes, this is something that I face in the classroom scenario regularly, in the university scenario in India, in every university. You're quite familiar with that, I guess. Yeah. Now, you mentioned that there is tons and tons of scholarship that talks about oppression, right? I would be very keen to know where are these tons, for the simple reason that I deal with these multiple communities. I'm not the only one. There are many other people. And we have done years of work with these distinctive kind of communities. When you talk to them, you know the caste names? I mean, are you familiar with any of the caste names? Do you know the Dakkalis? Do you know the Chindus? I'm sure. I'm not questioning you, but I'm sure you're familiar with them. When I mention it, it should make sense. So when you work with them of a different generation, 2 generations, 3 generations earlier, there's absolutely no sense of any inferiority or no sense of rage. This does not mean that they have become Brahminical. Not at all. They are very clear. Absolute clarity is there on their part. And we have videos. At some point, I'll show them, if time permits, not here. But these communities sustain their cultural background, the Jamba Purana, the multiple Jati Puranas that they maintain. The Jati Puranas are all maintained by these Jatis over many, many centuries. They have been maintaining them. I can give any number of examples of that kind. And this question of oppression, millions of years of or thousands of years of oppression is something that I barely come across in that. It comes out, especially after, you can historically also be dated, particularly, very specific period of time. Critical caste studies of a very recent origin. Largely the home base of these discourses is university. I'm talking about, in response to this gentleman's question, I'm responding, actually, I'm concerned about the communities and their cultures, which they sustain. It is not that they require a Brahmin to sustain them. Come on, Brahmin can't even go and understand that. And nobody makes the claim that they are the best representative of all the communities. No Brahmin knows these communities. And nobody felt inferior about that. And nobody from the Dakali community says that Brahmin is great, he knows what all I do. No. So what we need, it seems to me, in fact, I interact with my students. My students come with this Ambedkarite background quite often, which is not negative. I want to engage with that. So I tend to talk with them. Several days and days of discussion, months of discussion, semesters of discussion. Then they begin to see, what is it that your mother does? What kind of rituals does your father follow? What language do you speak? What gods do you pray? Whole range of things. What seasons do you follow? What festivals do you perform? All these become very important. That's the stuff of public humanities, if you want to use the term. I don't use the term, but that's the kind of thing. It is everyday life. This is being enacted in front of you. You live it. Bonalu is celebrated by many of these communities, right? So Jamapurana is rendered by not a Brahmin. It is rendered by Dakalis. Only Dakalis among the Chamars. So it's a much more intricate kind of structure. And I wish one could be sensitive to that so that we can begin to think about new ways of thinking. So biocultural formation, since I'm using the English language and in the English classroom, I don't want to use the term caste and caste system for the limitations it provides already. Already, the answer is given. Answer precedes the use of the phrase when the gentleman used it, okay? So I want to use the term, but also point out what the problem with such kind of usage is. So we need a different language now. And we need to be open to that. Whether it is done by Brahmin or non-Brahmin, it doesn't matter. But these names cannot be erased all that easily. The community is no biocultural formation will come forward and say that, okay, from tomorrow onwards, I'm a nameless person. No. Why is it Mandakrishna began to use the term Madhiga? So I think there are more complex kind of issues that are involved. I'll be very happy to sit and discuss with you. Yes, sir.
Yeah, I was wanting to follow up on the question that was asked earlier that you talked about the challenges of being in a university structure and tackling some of the questions that you raised. And I just wondered, I mean, not that I know anything about it, but there were ancient universities in India. And is there any historical precedent that you can leverage to bring kind of old university forms into modern universities that would allow you to tackle some of these issues better?
It's a real challenging question. When people talk, I refer to Nalanda, of course, Xuanzang, and so I think some of you know that Nalanda existed from 5th century till about 12th, 13th centuries, uninterrupted, flourishing. It attracted scholarship from students from all over the places in the East, and great learners from Chinese background came and studied there. So first of all, I don't call them universities, number one, because it's a specific term that's been developed in the European context in both periods, classical and the modern period. So the university that we have is a modern university, not the classical university. And of course, there are arguments now that are emerging, very fascinating arguments. The university structure and the architecture of the universities in the West are derivative of Buddhist frameworks, Buddhist Nalanda structures. So that's a very fascinating kind of historical work. But what I'm interested in is that the learning traditions that flourished there, what kind of subjects that they taught, Nalanda that is available. And then the debates extended for 1,000 years between Buddhists and then the non-Buddhists. This is very fascinating. But there is such a gap between us and them that is no longer alive in us, except in academic discourses. So we must find a place. There must be a passage made to bring forth such kind of reflections. Jati or caste has never been a significant theme of discussion in the Indian tradition at all, in the Sanskrit tradition. It is Jati, as I said, is a much larger term. So it is never sociology and then politics are very difficult subjects, and then difficult subjects to find in Indian reflective traditions. There's stray remarks here and there, but there's no systematic development of these ideas. So why is it the concept of politics did not develop? There's no Indian concept of politics in my view. We can't run to Arthashastra and find out here is the concept of politics. No, it's a Semitic concept, entirely Semitic concept, in my view. So there are more research, more inquiry that needs to be done, but we must begin in the classroom for me. That has to happen. Yeah. Yes, please.
Thank you. Thank you for your talk. I wanted to sort of follow up on Atika's earlier question and sort of ask how you see your role and responsibility in dealing with these concepts in the current political climate in India, and how you either, are comfortable, aligning with sort of other sort of a Hindu majoritarian politics, or how you resist having this work co-opted by those kind of forces.
Sure. Thank you for the question. This is quite a relevant question. I dance. So I never use the word Hindu in my work to start with. The concept doesn't make sense to me in my work. And I have hesitation now in the recent times to even use the word Hindu. This doesn't mean that I would use some other term from Sanskrit to describe this. So I'm using the term strategically Sanskrit because it's a nameless language, nameless name. It had no soil. It has no connections with blood. It has no nativity. It travels all the time. It's an anami. For various reasons, I use the term. Okay. And I know that you're very right. It can walk into it, can be embraced by people, but that shouldn't prevent me from continuing the inquiry of a different kind. So we have to do that. Okay. Even the dead are not free from enemies, and the enemy hasn't ceased to be victorious, Benjamin. So we have to be careful. One does the work in good faith. One goes ahead. So to be more specific, yes, people who are championing the new education policy, they approach me, they come to me and they talk to me. I don't mind participating in their discussions. I'll tell them to think more about, they tend to think that liberal arts program has been there in ancient India, which is rubbish. It doesn't work. They don't understand what liberal arts are. Okay. So they don't like what I do, but they, at the same time, they have not dismissed me so far. So I'm looking for people, even from that background, if they're open to further discussion, because our common goal here, in my view, a common pursuit of true knowledge, Lewis. So the common purpose here is to see whether a different language can be generated to grapple with the contemporary questions across all kinds of contexts and borders. That's the larger aim. Okay. So yes, in the process, posters were put up against me in the university, but that happens. These things happen, but one continues the work. That's what I do. It's not a direct answer. I'm not with BJP. I'm not with VHP. I'm not a card holding right winger, if you like. But the left and right are necessary to walk. So that's how one dances. Doesn't satisfy many people, I know, this answer, but I'm sorry, I can't help. I'm a teacher. Yeah.
One more question. Are there any others?
Two.
Oh, thank you for your insightful lecture. while listening to your lecture, one question that I kept reflecting about is how can we train our students to be intellectually multilingual? Because the current state of the humanities at the moment, most institutions are training students to be intellectually monolingual. I mean, to go back to our Bloom idea of Western canon, the whole knowledge system is shaped around the Western canon. And when people talk about diversity, it's often based on aesthetics. It's not diversity based on the curriculum. And in the field of African studies, there are pioneers of the colonial studies. I mean, Amy Césaire, Fanon, Albert Memmi, and others. But my frustration with their own scholarship is they were actually not providing an alternative archive of knowledge, although they were critiquing the colonial European epistemology of knowledge, but they were equally trapped in the same bubble of colonial epistemology. They were not providing an alternative archive of knowledge. And I think one of the challenges we've been facing, especially in African studies, John Mogane at Harvard University came up with this idea. He called it necro-linguistics, where students are not fluent in any language, whether European or African language. So it's hard for students now to even be able to excavate and engage in other non-Western canon. So in your own view, based on your training, how do you think we can really achieve this goal of training students that will be fluent and can engage a diverse range of intellectual tradition that is not fixated on this Western canon?
Absolutely. Thank you. Actually, excellent question, because it reminded me of my own trajectory and it resonated with my trajectory. I remember when we organized Ngugi wa Thiong'o's visit to Hyderabad to the same university. He spent 4 days with us. I did a long interview with him. He said, Venkat, you see, what we should do is that try and then get my work translated into directly into Telugu. And this has been done by a political activist who is now house arrested, 82-year-old person, lives in Bombay. He translated this work into this one. He said that I want my work. Let's start a journal where Gikuyu and Telugu work will be published. All these ventures couldn't go further, but Gugi, we had a great, kind of connection with Gugi. So that is very necessary. And your critique of an earlier generation without dismissing them is something that I do share. For example, the great post-colonial, intellectuals from the Indian background, I sort of grew with that kind of background. I went through the tunnel of post-coloniality, and then I began to see that the kind of work that is necessary, the type you're referring to, to do that work, I can't simply obsess myself and indulge in this work. This is not disregarding their work and the historical moments where that work was so significant. But at the same time, I thought that there's a different work, different kind of questions, different kind of languages will have to be explored. I am, with regard specifically to answer your question, I'm in an advantageous situation, maybe a privileged situation, you might say, which is that my students come from, first of all, different languages. And each of these students can speak at least 2 or 3 languages. Now, what I work with the given. What language do you come from? What language do you speak? I ask the students. I don't ask their name. What's the language that you speak? So the language connects me directly to the literature background and the cultural background that he or she comes from. Then I pick up the examples and relate her. I get to know her name only halfway through the semester. But this is more important. So the intellectual inheritances or cultural inheritances, which come through the forms and languages, they become important. So first of all, my understanding of the student and background is based on the language and culture from which he or she comes. And then they're hesitant. They have moved more into English. As a result, they distance themselves from their languages. But it becomes very important if a student wants to do research after the MA, if he or she wants to do research with me, then they'll have to know their languages, or at least be willing to work with their languages. So they write the thesis in English, Even if there is English bad, I take these students. But their knowledge of their languages must be very important. And I can build on the basis of that. At least I try to build on the basis of that. I'm not sure this can become a model, but I think if we were to work in specific situations, like in Nigeria, or like in some other places, Jamaica, then probably I think one responds to that situation. And I'm not capable of that because I've not been trained in that. But in the Indian scenario, whether I go to any part of India, I'll be able to relate myself. And also see whether it's possible to relate across the context also. That's important. I hope it provides some answer. Yes. Yes.
Last question.
I'm sort of thinking about two things that you made. Thank you. One being Sanskrit being the common thread and the kind of enduring nature of Sanskrit. And I'm thinking of whether you're also kind of thinking about the colonizing aspect of Sanskrit. I'm thinking of languages such as Tibetan, Nepali, a lot of other languages where the essence of knowledge has kind of become, I guess what impact does Sanskrit, those languages and the philosophies, what impact does their interaction with Sanskrit? And the fact that Sanskrit was the dominant and perhaps at the time, the most viable form of writing those philosophies down. I wonder what you think about that. I'm thinking about Tibetan Buddhist traditions where the philosophy has been written down, or the Tibetan language has been inspired by or kind of draws from Sanskrit, but is not a part of Sanskritized literature. And the other claim that, and we can talk about this later as well, these are long questions perhaps, but again, thinking about Hindi or Hindustani language, thinking about its interaction with other languages. Hindi is not just derived from Sanskrit, it's involves so many languages. So again, I'm kind of thinking about how you think about the endurance of Sanskrit, and your thought is Sanskrit as a common thread, but what about all these other languages and philosophies that have kind of become invisibilized almost?
Sure. Okay. I think the second question can be easily answered very quickly. I never claimed that all these other languages other than Sanskrit are derived from Sanskrit. No, I don't make that claim. Whatever their origins are, okay? But their interface with Sanskrit is a peculiar one. These languages are fecundated by Sanskrit. I'm not sure the fecundated is the right word, but anyway, let me use it. So the interface has enriched these languages. I mean, think about Tamil, think about Telugu, Kannada. 9th century Kannada was different. And then exposure to Mahabharata. Same as the case with Telugu, Kannada, Marathi, whole range of languages that you can think about, modern Indian languages. I'm not saying they've originated from Sanskrit. I think linguists might say that they have emerged from Middle Indian languages, okay? But I'm making a different claim. I think these languages and the reflected terminology that is available in languages today, to a large extent, has come from Sanskrit. But incorporated into the languages, become part of those languages. My students say, sir, this is a Malayalam word. How can you say it's Sanskrit? No, it comes from Sanskrit, I tell them. Then sometimes they get frustrated, but they will say, oh, I didn't know that. So this itself is an extraordinary experience for me, for them, and for me. The way Sanskrit, you learn it on the run, okay? That's the first question is a tough question for the simple reason that I don't know the languages. Second important point is that I can only respond historically. From around 7th century onwards, the relation between Tibet and then Nalanda was flourishing. And then Nalanda sends a representative to establish a university in Tibet. And then luckily, a large number of manuscripts from Nalanda moved to Tibet before they were destroyed for copying and then translation. That whole translation activity, copying activity was taking place across the Silk Road. That was happening. So texts from Nalanda went there and they were luckily preserved there. Okay. So the impact of Buddhism across all these places, including China, is something that is worth rereading again from the Sanskrit base. This does not mean that Sanskrit should become a hegemonic supreme language henceforth in the world and then the most victorious. No, I'm not making such claims. My claim is very simple. If Sanskrit and European originary language had some commonality, how did these languages manifest? We have a concrete evidence of Sanskrit flourishing across centuries. There is a thought, language is used in terms of thought and cultural forms. How did these departures take place? Same principle can be applied in the context of Tibetan Buddhism as well. It seems to me, but I'm not a scholar of Tibetan Buddhism. I wish I could know Tibetan language, but I'm fascinated by that history. Okay, so there's a tremendous amount of interaction between Buddhism and many, many other. I mean, if you saw the recent historical work, Chris Beckworth's work or Dalrymple's work, you know, it's making waves now. So, but Chris Beckworth's work is much more interesting. Yeah. Thank you.
I think it's time for us to adjourn down the hall to the reception to keep the conversation going. Before we do that, let me just remind you of a few events that are coming up. So in what I described as this series within the series, in which we're inviting people who are sort of on the front lines of humanities teaching in different parts of the world, we will be joined on April 1st by Ji-Hyun Lim, who is the director of the Critical Global Studies Institute at Sogang University in Seoul for a lecture called Victimhood, Nationalism, Global History and Memory. And then on April 22nd, we'll be joined by Sarah Nuttall, Professor of Literary and Cultural Studies at Wits University in Johannesburg. And her talk is titled Souths, Emerging Conceptualizations. We have a whole bunch of other events coming up in remainder of winter and spring quarters, but just check our website for the events calendar and you'll see what those are. We're lucky to have Professor Rao on campus for a couple more days. And this week, first of all, tomorrow, you can join him at 12 noon at Wallenberg Hall for a talk exploring the concept of maps, memory maps, and their role in understanding mnemocultures, memory cultures. That event is hosted by our partner, the Center for Spatial and Textual Analysis, or CESTA. And then on Thursday, day after tomorrow at 10:30, down the hall in the boardroom, we're going to hold an informal conversation about the topics brought forth in this event. And that's just for anybody who shows up. We will be joined virtually by former SHC fellow Radhika Cole, who was a dissertation fellow here a couple of years ago and is currently assistant professor of literature at Claremont McKenna College in Southern California. Radhika's scholarship is precisely on the connection between Sanskrit and Western European early modern literature. And so we've invited Radhika to give a response to this talk and to kick off a discussion on Thursday. So if you're free Thursday morning at 10:30, it should be a lively conversation, so feel free to join us. Please join me in thanking Professor Rao one more time.